Alright, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. I'll get started. This will be a brief review of Session 5, which we did last week. Okay, so we ended Session 4 with Surat al-Fatiha, and we began Surat al-Baqarah. We started with a discussion about the names of the surahs, where they come from, what they refer to. So, with the exception of pretty much Surat al-Fatiha, the names of the surahs are for identification, not really descriptive of content. So Surat al-Fatiha is the opener. It describes the content as well as identifies the surahs. Pretty much all of the subsequent surahs the names are only for identification. And they're derived from perhaps a subject within that surah. And those names of the surahs are given to us by the Prophet, peace be upon him, himself. And many surahs have different names as well. So, and at the time of the first, even say 100 years ago, if you find an old copy of the Quran, they don't have names of the surahs on them. So, Al-Baqarah, which means the cow, is also referred to as Surah Ummatain, or the Surah of the two Ummahs. The Ummah of Prophet of Moses, alayhi salam, and the Ummah of Prophet Muhammad, alayhi sallam. So we began with Alif, Lam, Mim, the first ayah of Surah Al-Baqarah, and the first letters of the surah. We talked about al-huruf al-muqatta'at, or the disconnected letters. Right? There are 29, I believe, such surahs in the Quran. Another example would be, we talked about Surah Ali Imran, and then also Surah number 10, Surah 19, and have different letters which begin the surah. And so, in essence, we really don't know what they're for at the core of it. We have numbers of different theories. Scholars have commented on it. And we talked about the many different ideas behind, wisdom behind the huruf al-muqatta'at, or the disconnected letters. So when we read, it forces us to intellectually submit to Allah, because we have no idea what they mean. So we are receptive to understanding things which we previously had no idea what they mean, right? It also, when we read, it keeps us grounded by keeping us focused on the real and not so much on the abstract. So we talked about how Umar Muzaffar gave the example of his student where he asked him, is there a God? And he's like, well, I don't know. He's like, well, do you know you're sitting there, right? And he actually had to pause and think about it for a second, because he was so focused on the abstract, he couldn't answer immediately a very obvious question, right? So when we get too distracted by the abstract, we lose track of the real. And in Islam, we always start with the concrete and build upwards from that. We talked about how in pretty much all instances of these letters beginning a surah, it's followed by a reference to how Allah transfers knowledge to us, right? ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ. This book, there is no doubt within it. And in other surahs, there are similar type verses which follow. So then we actually went into the next verse. ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ. So we start with ذَلِكَ is commonly, when we read in translation, says this, right? Which is a mistranslation. It actually means that, right? And we talked about al-kitab, which translates to the book. But the Quran, in its essence, is not a book, so to speak. It's actually an oral recitation. So then we went to the part of Surah Al-Baqarah which says, Kutiba alaykum as-siyam, or it has the same root word, but it means prescribed for you is fasting, as it was prescribed to people before you. So a more proper translation for ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابِ is that that is the prescription, right? Not this is the book, right? So that changes the commonly accepted translation that we have been taught previously. La rayba fihi. We talked about la rayba means there is no doubt, right? And then we have the three dots, right, around which begin, are at the front of and at the back of fihi, or in this, right? So that's called mu'annaka, right? And it means that you can think of that almost as a semicolon, right? There's two ways to read this verse. So we would say, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ, and we can pause there and then recite هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, or we can say, ذَلِكَ الْكِتَابُ لَا رَيْبَ فِيهِ هُدًى لِلْمُتَّقِينَ, right? And there's that gives us two different, subtly different translations to what this ayah is referring to. So when we say La Rayba Fihi, we're talking about the Quran being the container itself, the container of knowledge, right? When we say Fihi Hudan lil Muttaqin, we're talking about the content, right? What's actually in it. So it refers to, there's no doubt in the container itself, and then there's no doubt as to what's actually in the container, if you can think of that reference. Let's see. So, Huda lil Muttaqin. Huda means guidance, right? Guidance lil Muttaqin, for those who seek taqwa. So we talked about what this word taqwa means. Commonly translated as fear, right? Fear Allah, which is a translation which our teacher Umar said is not a good translation because it evokes this, this sort of, fear, it portrays God in we may see it as in a negative way. So there are in the Quran, throughout the Quran, when this word taqwa is written, there are a number of different translations which may be appropriate to that ayah. Let's see. So we talked about the different meanings of taqwa and the root word meaning that it's a shield, right? Is to shield oneself. To seek taqwa is to shield oneself against the threats of this world that we may see, right? The threats which come between us and seeking closeness with Allah, right? I personally prefer the term God consciousness, right? Taqwa meaning seeking a level of God consciousness, right? So now that we have really what we're reading this for, right? That is a prescription. There is no doubt within it for those who seek God consciousness. We have a goal now, right? And the goal, the priority now in this whole thing of Islam is to gain taqwa, right? And Umar ended that last session with a very good quote that I like. He said, when you act upon knowledge that Allah gives you, you get knowledge that's not even written into it, right? So when we seek taqwa, it opens up the door to other knowledge, right? And thus ended our commentary on the first ayah. Thank you.
Very good. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim.